Alright, a very good morning, class. And for today, we'll be starting with a new chapter from your text, Footprints Without Feet. And as you can see on the screen, the name of the title is Footprints Without Feet. And in this chapter, we'll be dealing with the story of an invisible man. I won't tell you much about it in the beginning itself, it's quite an interesting story. So, as I'm reading along line by line, I would suggest you do the same. So, Footprints Without Feet by H.G. Wells. Now, let's get on with the text. The two boys started in surprise at the fresh muddy imprints of a pair of bare feet. What was a barefooted man doing on the steps of a house in the middle of London? And where was the man? As they gazed, a remarkable sight met their eyes. A fresh footmark appeared from nowhere. Further footprints followed one after another, descending the steps and progressing down the street. The boys followed, fascinated, till the muddy impressions became fainter and fainter and at last disappeared altogether. The explanation of the mystery was really quite simple enough. The bewildered boys had been following a scientist who had just discovered how to make the human body transparent. Griffin, the scientist, had carried out experiment after experiment to prove that the human body could become invisible. Finally, he swallowed certain rare drugs and his body became as transparent as a sheet of glass, though it remained as solid as glass. Brilliant scientist though he was, Griffin was rather a lawless person. His landlord disliked him and tried to eject him. In revenge, Griffin set fire to the house. To get away without being seen, he had to remove his clothes. Thus, it was that he became a homeless wanderer, without clothes, without money, and quite invisible, until he happened to step in some mud and left footprints as he walked. Now, the story begins with two boys who looked surprised, alright? They saw footprints and they were surprised because who would walk barefooted, alright? That too in London, near the steps of a house. But then they were even more surprised when suddenly a footprint appeared out of nowhere, then another one. So they followed the footprints, and after some time, जुन चाहिँ त्यो फुटप्रिन्ट थियो त्यो हल्का हुँदै गयो मड हटिँदै गयो the footprint became fainter and then it disappeared altogether. So now the writer tells us that it was the footprints left behind by a scientist named Griffin. Alright, Griffin was a brilliant scientist and he had been trying very hard to prove that human body can become transparent. Now, I'm sure you know what transparent means, right? So, he had finally consumed a combination of rare drugs which made him invisible. And he was a brilliant scientist. Obviously, he is able to turn himself invisible. वो एकदम brilliant here. But then he was lawless. He had no regard for the law. He was, you can say, like an evil person, alright? No regards to society and its laws. And so, उसको हाउस ओनरले उसलाई घरबाट निकालिदियो. But to take revenge, उसले के गरे हाउस ओनरको घर जलाइदियो. And then to get away, obviously he'll be seen running away. So he took off all his clothes and he ran away because now he is invisible and nobody can see him. But then he has no money, he has no clothes, and now he has become a wanderer. He escaped easily enough from the boys who followed his footprints in London, but his adventures were by no means over. He had chosen a bad time of the year to wander about London without clothes. It was midwinter, the air was bitterly cold, and he could not do without clothes. Instead of walking about the streets, he decided to slip into a big clothing store for warmth. Closing time arrived, and as soon as the doors were shut, Griffin was able to give himself the pleasure of clothing and feeding himself without regard to expense. He broke open boxes and wrappers and fitted himself with warm clothes. Soon, with shoes, an overcoat, and a wide brimmed hat. He became a fully dressed and visible person. In the kitchen of the restaurant, he found cold meat and coffee, and he followed up the meal with sweets and wine taken from the grocery store. Finally, he settled down to sleep in the pile of quills. If only Griffin had managed to wake up in good time, all might have been well. As it was, he did not wake up until the assistants were already arriving next morning. When he saw a couple of them approaching, he panicked and began to run. They naturally gave chase. In the end, he was able to escape only by quickly taking off his newly found clothes. So once more, he had found himself invisible but naked in the chill January air. So now he has escaped from the landlord. But then it is midwinter, the air is very cold, and he is naked. So he goes inside a clothing store, and naturally nobody sees him. Right? He is invisible. So he took shelter there. And जब त्यो store बन्द भयो, then he took the opportunity. He wore new clothes, store ko टिपेर. He went to the store kitchen. He had cold meat, he had coffee, he had wine, and then he slept nice. Oh, he wore clothes as well, all right, a long trench coat. So he's very warm, very comfortable, eaten well, and he sleeps inside the store itself. And now the writer says, if only he had woken up in time, but then he was so well fed and maybe he got drunk with the wine. So what happens? Store ko assistant ru store ma आइपुग्छ. Now this Griffin थाहा that somebody is there, and so he runs, and the store people give chase. All right, they chase after him, and so the only option that he has is to open the clothes. उसले आफ्नो लुगा फेरि सबै खोल्छ, and once again he becomes invisible. But then at what expense? He is left naked in the cold once again. This time he decided to try the stock of a theatrical company in the hope of finding not only clothes but something that would hide his empty space above his shoulders. Shivering with cold, he hurried to Drury Lane, the center of the theatre world. He soon found a suitable shop. He made his way, invisible, upstairs, and came out a little later wearing bandages round his forehead, dark glasses, false nose, big bushy side whiskers, and a large hat. To escape without being seen, he callously attacked the shopkeeper from behind, after which he robbed him of all the money he could find. So once again, he's in the street, he's naked, he's feeling cold. So now he tries his luck at a place called Drury Lane, where there were a lot of theaters, all right, so he could find costumes and costumes, because he wanted to cover his face as well. Ule luga to long sa, but then above his shoulders, the neck area and face, it's all empty. So he goes to the theater and he finds everything that he is looking for. He finds clothes, he finds bandages with which he wraps his forehead, he finds sunglasses, a fake nose, all right, duplicate naak pani लगाएर, sunglass लगाएर, side whiskers haru, सबै यस्तो जुङ्गा दारी टाइपको साइड विस्कर्स हामीले जुन चाहिँ केटाले भन्छन् छरी भनेर. So that is side whiskers. So त्यो सबै लगाएर it looked as if he was a whole person, just a person who is injured and is wearing bandages. But then while coming out, उसले चान्स नलिनु लागि के गर्छ, त्यो एउटा मान्छेलाई एट्याक गरिदिन्छ, अन्त उसकोमा भएको जति पैसा छ त्यो सबै लगेर he runs off. Sorry. So let's continue. Eager to get away from crowded London, he took a train to the village of Epping, where he booked 2 rooms at the local inn. The arrival of a stranger at an inn in winter was in any case an unusual event. A stranger of such uncommon appearance set all tongues wagging. Mrs. Hall, the landlord's wife, made every effort to be friendly, but Griffin had no desire to talk and told her, "My reason for coming to Epping is a desire for solitude. I do not wish to be disturbed in my work. Besides, an accident has affected my face." Satisfied that her guest was an eccentric scientist, and in view of the fact that he had paid her in advance, Mrs. Hall was prepared to excuse his strange habits and irritable temper. But the stolen money did not last long, and presently Griffin had to admit that he had no more ready cash. He pretended, however, that he was expecting a check to arrive at any moment. Shortly afterwards, a curious episode occurred. Very early in the morning, a clergyman and his wife were awakened by noises in the study. Creeping downstairs, they heard the chink of money being taken from the clergyman's decks. Without making any noise, and with a poker grasped firmly in his hand, the clergyman flung the door open. Surrender! Then, to his amazement, he realized that the room appeared to be empty. He and his wife looked under the decks and behind the curtains and even up the chimney. There wasn't a sign of anybody. Yet the decks had been opened and the housekeeping money was missing. Extraordinary affair, the clergyman kept saying for the rest of the day. So now that our invisible man, that is the scientist Griffin, he has money, all right? So he thought of leaving that place. He thought that this is not safe here, all right? I've already stolen from a clothing store. He has already stolen money. He has already stolen clothes. He has set fire to the house of the house owner. So उसले त्यो ठाउँ भागेर गयो ट्रेनमा चढेर कहाँ गयो इपिङ भन्ने ठाउँमा. Now Ipping was a small place. So उसले एउटा इनमा इन इज अ होटल राइट sort of a small hotel. So होटलमा एउटा रुम लिएर बस्यो अरे. And it was very unusual for some tourists to come up to Ipping in January. त्यसै नै अनयुजुअल थियो. अझै अर्को अनयुजुअल के थियो, द बिहेभियर अफ ग्रिफिन. ऊ रुममा मात्रै बस्थ्यो, अलग्गै बस्थ्यो, रुड न रुड बोल्थ्यो, कोहीसँग पनि बोल्थेन. बट ही टोल्ड द इनकिपर, अल राइट, इनको जुन चाहिँ मालिक थियो मिसेस हल, उसलाई के भनेको थियो द्याट आई एम हियर टु बी अलोन, डु नट डिस्टर्ब मी. मेरो फेस पनि एक्सिडेन्टमा इन्जर भएको भनेको छ अरे. एन्ड ही पेड हर इन एडभान्स, अगाडि नै पैसा दिइसकेको थियो. सो मिसेस हल ह्याड नो प्रब्लम, उसले पैसा पनि पाइसकेको छ. It's just that he is a bit eccentric, alikiti strange, alright? But then he hasn't harmed anyone. He just wants to stay alone. So उसले यादै गरेन. And he stayed there like that for a few days, but slowly उसको पैसा सक्यो. Now he has to pay more. So he went to Mrs. Hall and he said, I am out of money, but don't worry, I will be paid very soon. I am about to receive a check. But obviously he's not received any check. So on that day, something strange happened in the town of Ipping. The clergyman got robbed. Clergymanलाई चाहिँ चोरी भएछ घरमा. And it was very strange episode as well. The clergyman and his wife were sleeping and suddenly they heard noises like somebody was taking money from the drawers. He and his wife went down and he had a poker stick in his hand. Now what is a poker? Like you have seen fireplaces, right? Dauraharu balcha, and daura baldakheri obviously at certain point of time you tend to poke the wood rod so that the fire keeps burning. That rod is known as the poker rod, all right? So he takes the poker rod. So the clergyman and his wife, he entered the room with a poker in his hand. But strangely, there was no one in the room. They checked everywhere. They checked under the table, they checked along the fireplace, the chimney. No one was there, and yet somehow they had been robbed. But that was not the end of extraordinary episodes, alright? That was not a one-time event. Another thing happened, but it was not as extraordinary as the behavior of Mrs. Hall's furniture a little later that morning. The landlord and his wife were up very early and were surprised to see the scientist's door wide open. Usually it was shut and locked. And he was furious if anyone entered his room. The opportunity seemed too good to be missed. They peeped around the door, saw nothing, and decided to investigate. The bedclothes were cold, showing that the scientist must have been up for some time. And stranger still, the clothes and bandages that he always wore were lying about the room. All of a sudden, Mrs. Hall heard a sniff close to her ear. A moment later, the hat of the bedpost leaped up and dashed itself into her face. Then the bedroom chair became alive. Springing into the air, it charged straight at her, legs foremost. As she and her husband turned away in terror, the extraordinary chair pushed them both out of the room and then appeared to slam and lock the door after them. Mrs. Hall almost fell down the stairs in hysterics. She was convinced that the room was haunted by spirit and that the stranger had somehow caused these to enter into the furniture. My poor mother used to sit in that chair, she moaned. To think it should rise up against me now. The feeling among the neighbors was that the trouble was caused by witchcraft. But witchcraft or not, when news of the burglary at the clergyman's home became known, the strange scientist was strongly suspected of having a hand in it. Suspicion grew even stronger as he suddenly produced some ready cash, though he had admitted not long before he had no money. The village constable was secretly sent for. Instead of waiting for the constable, Mrs. Hall went to the scientist, who had somehow mysteriously appeared from his empty bedroom. So, the clergyman got robbed, alright? The next thing what happened was one day, Mrs. Hall, the innkeeper, and her husband, they were walking around the inn and suddenly they saw that the stranger's room was open. Usually it was locked, alright? And so they saw an opportunity to see what he was up to because he was very strange and mysterious. And so they were curious. So they peeped around the room. They felt the bed and it felt cold, meaning he had been up for quite some time. Then he looked around. Then she and her husband looked around. Then they saw the clothes which the stranger used to wear, the bandages, the hat, everything was thrown about. Then suddenly Mrs. Hall heard someone close to her ear, or like breathing, उसको कान के छेउमा कसले breathe गरेको जस्तो सुन्यो. Then suddenly a hat was thrown at her face. Then out of the extraordinary thing happened, चौकी यस्तो उठाएर only the chair was in the air and the chair was pushing the wife and husband and they were shown out of the room and the chair somehow locked the door as well. Mrs. Hall was in hysterics, alright? She was scared beyond life. She thought that her room is now haunted by a spirit. And everyone thought that this is because of the guest that is staying there. He is bringing in spirits inside the room. But spirit or not, once they heard that clergyman had been robbed, and Mrs. Hall telling them that the guest of the room had paid in cash, even though ek din agari ule ke bhane the, I don't have money. And yet he was the first suspect. So they sent for the police. But then Mrs. Hall became very impatient. Police ne na पर्खे बसेर she went herself to confront the man. ऊ आफै बोल्नु गयो अरे उसँग. Because that man suddenly appeared from inside the room. अघिसम्म रूममा कोही थिएन. Some chair flew in the air, pushed Mrs. Hall and her husband out, and the door was locked. So nobody's inside. And yet, somehow, the guest came in from inside the room. And so she went and confronted him. She told him, I want to know what you have been doing to my chairs upstairs. She demanded. And I want to know how is it you came out of an empty room and how you entered a locked room. The scientist was quick, always quick-tempered. Now he became furious. You don't understand who or what I am, he shouted. Very well, I will show you. Suddenly he threw off bandages, whiskers, spectacles, and even nose. It took him only a minute to do this. The horrified people in the bar found themselves staring at a headless man. Mr. Jeffers, the constable, now arrived and was quite surprised to find that he had to arrest a man without a head. But Jeffers was not easily prevented from doing his duty. If a magistrate's warrant ordered a person's arrest, then that person had to be arrested, with or without his head. There followed a remarkable scene as the policeman tried to get hold of a man who was becoming more and more invisible as he threw off one garment after another. Finally, a shirt flew into the air, and the constable found himself struggling with someone he could not see. at all. Some people tried to help him, but found themselves hit by blows that seemed to come from nowhere. In the end, Japhers was knocked unconscious as he made a last attempt to hold on to the unseen scientist. They were nervous, excited cries of "Hold him!" But this was easier said than done. Griffin had shaken himself free, and no one knew where to lay hands on him. So when Mrs. Hall went to confront Griffin, he was always short tempered, but then he became furious when she told him, "What did you do to the furniture? All right, how did you come with the empty room?" When he was put up with all those questions, he became angry and he shouted at her. He told her, "You don't know who I am or what I am capable of. I'll show you what I can do." And then he started to remove his bandages, the hat, and people were dumbfounded. All right, they were shocked at because they were looking at a headless man. Then suddenly the police arrived as well, Constable Jaffer, and he was like in a state of shock. He saw a man without a head, but then that didn't prevent him from doing his duty. He thought the magistrate wants me to have him arrested, so I will arrest him with or without his head. And then